Leader of the third party.
Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, the veil of secrecy over the ministerial panel promised by Serenity's death is wrong. The Deputy Premier patting your government on the back for a public-facing piece, which is a final report, while keeping everything else behind closed doors, is pitiful. All panel deliberations except necessary confidential information must occur in public. To the Premier, legislative committees regularly move in camera when the need arises, but otherwise they do their work in public. Will you please direct this panel to follow the same procedure?
Agreed. Hear, hear.
Honourable Premier.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, when the member opposite first asked us to consider this, he began it by premising it with reference to the work that had been done by the former Minister of Human Services, Mr. Boulard. Now, as we know, the work that he did in the panel that he created was not an all-party committee. It was a party that consisted primarily of experts, and it was a panel to which opposition members were invited to come to observe. Mr. Speaker, what we are proposing instead gives tremendous opportunity for engagement of members opposite, and it will allow for excessive public opportunity, very high levels of transparency, but it will also not provide a platform for politics.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Thank you. First supplemental.
Well, the Premier promised an all-party committee in public, and she's broken that so far. The terms of reference for the ministerial panel are narrowly focused on the death review process in the child intervention system. While those issues are critical, the lack of protection and follow-up for Serenity runs into an abysmal depth. It includes looking at the ME's office, the RCMP, Human Services, and the Minister's office itself. To the Premier, Serenity's case points to a failure of multiple agencies, offices, and public employees. Under the Public Inquiries Act, you can order a public inquiry. Will you do so, please?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that the member opposite ought to read the terms of reference more carefully. In fact, it is within those terms of reference that the issue of the death review process will be addressed, and it will address all the actions of all the agencies that the member opposite just spoke of. So that's the way to go forward. That's the way to get to a solution quickly. That's the way to get to a point where next spring we bring in legislation to remove a lot of the barriers and to streamline this process and to ensure that there is a much higher level of transparency in terms of how these investigations proceed, Mr. Speaker.
We have second supplemental now.
The problem, Mr. Speaker, is that the minister can throw a blanket over all that information if he wants to under the terms of reference. Exactly. Serenity's abuse and subsequent deaths suggest a shocking lack of concern for the welfare of our Indigenous children. All of Alberta has seen in recent weeks the Minister of Human Services failed to use the authority of his office to take control of a terrible situation. They no longer have faith in him. Premier, when you were in opposition, you called for resignations based on what you saw as a lack of ministerial accountability.
That's right.
This case is clear-cut. Will you replace your two ministers?
Good question.
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, our minister has worked diligently on supporting the work of his ministry and supporting child intervention. And you know what the first thing he did, Mr. Speaker, was when he became minister, he looked at what had been proposed under that member opposite's proposed budget. And you know what it was, Mr. Speaker? It was $600 million a year coming from child protection, Mr. Speaker. $600 million per year was proposed to be taken out of child intervention by those folks over there. And this minister over here said no. He restored that funding. He brought in a $37 million increase because he is committed to making this.
Thank you,